Welcome back to Fitness or Fiction. Today we are joined with our good buddy, Bryan Shymko. He is the co-owner of the Calgary Movement Studio, and he's been in the game of training since 2010. It's been at least a hot minute. Cue the intro.
Okay, Bryan, so we had you on today because you are a guy that has a lot of experience. But what we're doing with this little montage of talking to people is we're going back and forth, just asking them questions about like their experience in the fitness industry. We're kind of going to start in that zone of how did you get into fitness yourself? Then we'll transition. We're going to start talking about your experience as a trainer and things like that. And then, of course, at the end, we have to do a shameless plug for Calgary Movement Studio. So we're going to talk about that and how you arrived in that scenario. So first things first, when did fitness first hit your radar?
Well, first things first, guys, thanks for having me on the podcast. I believe this is my first podcast, so a little nervous here. So here we go. How I arrived in the fitness industry. No, just kidding.
You're making some real solid eye contact.
Good eye contact. I do what I can. I'm not too sure what they're doing on podcasts. If I talk to you, I'm there. Okay. So my fitness journey, I guess, started a little bit more when I was, younger. I kind of did a lot of hockey, and most importantly, I probably did more taekwondo. Competitively, I used to fight at a national level. So from there, I just had a lot of good coaches, a lot of really good coaches that kind of helped me through whatever sports as I progressed through. I was always one of those guys that was jack of all trades, master of none. So, I'd play a little bit of football, a little bit of hockey, a little bit of all that kind of stuff. And I like to think it kept me out of trouble, because if it wasn't for sports, I'd probably be into other situations, especially coming from old Sarnia, Ontario. So outside of that, I kind of knew exactly what I wanted to do once I got into college. I wanted to be a trainer, but I didn't know I could make a living doing it. So I went through about 7 years of school just to prove to myself that I probably could make it.
Just to pretend you're smart.
Pretend
be honest.
Smart, teach my, prove to my future employees I could do something for 7 years straight. Kind of do things reasonably well and pass some stuff. So after about my 7 years of school, I walked into Curtis's gym at old Edgemont World Health, and after a stumbling interview, I think he gave me a little bit of a shot. So after that, it's been kind of training ever since. So I still feel like I didn't really get into actually training up until about maybe 5 years into training. And that's, I guess, kind of when I found a little bit of the FRC system. I mean, a little shameless plug for the FRC system, the FRS.
So you mean like your first 5 years, you were kind of just like wading through the waters? What do you mean?
First 5 years, I was just learning the personal training game. A lot of it was, not used to selling, not used to training people, not used to that kind of stuff. So it was really just kind of getting into the industry and kind of getting used to that whole grinding it out and getting used to, 12-hour days of just putting in FaceTime and, just putting in the hours. So once those hours kind of accumulated, started to feel like there was something missing within the training aspect of things. So when I was training people, it was like someone would come in. I always get the special cases because I had a kinesiology background. I was a cheap trainer, so whenever somebody would come in and buy the paid in full package or whatever the heck it was.
Point of sale.
Point of sale.
Yeah.
It's the point of sale package. And if these guys had some kind of knee, back, hip, they'd be given to me. So I would get to a certain point where I just couldn't do anything with them. No lunges, no squats, no leg press, no whatever, without knee pain. So I felt like there was something missing. So I came across the FRC. I think a lot of people did on Instagram. Kind of see some different ways of training, different ways of moving, and it was kind of interesting. So I kind of went out and did an FRC certification out in Seattle, and for me, that kind of changed the game. So that kind of changed a little bit the way I thought about training, training people, and stuff like that.
So I'll just unpack that a second for anybody that doesn't know what it is. So functional range systems is a system created by Andreo Spina,
Yep.
Last name like spinal without the L.
Spina,
yeah. So this is a pretty big system now. It's expanded into the internal strength model. FRC is functional range conditioning. It's kind of like the generalist understanding of their system. And then you have things like FRA, which is functional range assessment, so you can do assessments better. Kin stretch, which obviously we do at the Calgary Movement Studio. Why was that such a game changer for you? Like, what was different about the thought process? And if you could keep it into like you're explaining it to somebody who's not already involved in fitness, that'll make it even better.
Well, I guess you kind of just said it right there. It gave me a thought process. Before, I don't think I had one. Like when somebody walked in, we used to have some general assessments where in most cases we'd be be assessing a movement for some reason. So we'd be assessing an inline lunge. Does that sound familiar? would be assessing an overhead squat for some reason, and just something missing. So again, didn't really have much to build off of after that assessment. So okay, somebody can't do a inline lunge, we give them a score at a 2 out of 3, and then what? I don't know, somebody said a 3, do we just stop? Do we just stop training that joint? The inline lunge is a 3, it's good. Is that as good as it's gonna get?
We also used to just test like a TRX row just to look at this, like see how the scapula moved.
I don't know. So anyway, so it essentially gave me a thought process, a legitimate like process from start to end. Or if there is an end, but definitely a good starting position. So what we look at now is essentially joint by joint movement. So there's no sense of looking at a movement if we're going to narrow it down to a joint anyways. So we have a look at the joint, and we can assume from looking at the joints what the movement's going to look like. So and then from there we look at whether it's deficiencies, we look at capacities, and then from there we build off of that. So if we have somebody that say has no internal external rotation of their hip, I would probably not program a lot of stuff that involves internal and external rotation. In the meantime, I'd be programming stuff to increase internal and external rotation and go into that kind of thought process from there. So, it's not to negate the full pattern type training, but it's to put a little more emphasis and a little more ownership over your joints.
So we kind of have an idea, like your rough journey going through university into getting your job at World Health Gym Movement. I'm curious. Just I don't know you that well. So what are you doing right now for your own training? What's your own personal training look like for yourself? Yeah, you exercise.
Yeah, I exercise. I try to at least. I just had a daughter about 2 years ago. So I think anyone who's had a kid starts to realize how much more challenging it is to get into the gym. So my focus has shifted a little bit from the pattern type training, strength work, to a little more joint strength training. Obviously a little bit of the FRS. Trying to get out of that mindset of like trying to pack everything in an hour. So Dre Spina always talks about, your training day is a 24-hour day. So it doesn't have to start and end within an hour and jam pack everything in an hour. So now I've been kind of picking up piecing things together, 10, 15 minutes here, 10, 15 minutes there. So might throw down some zone 1, zone 2 for about 10, 15 minutes. Might throw down, 15 minutes of some shoulder capsule, whether it's pails, rails, a little bit of, lift offs, end range options, and then maybe move into one kind of pattern-based exercise. So things have been a little bit more focused, a little more streamlined, but a little bit less volume these days.
So again, there's a lot of stuff to talk about there. So pails and rails, progressive and regressive angular isometrics. Typically in functional range systems, we're going to be using that to augment ranges. That's kind of what we use. End range options. I like to talk about that a lot when people say, what is mobility? You can just say, well, it's strength at the end range at the end of the day. Like, what range can you actually control? That's a good way of describing it.
Well, the other way of thinking about too, and the other way I've kind of been described to me is like it's strength training, right? So if we do have a good strength and conditioning program, then we shouldn't be leaving out end ranges. So at the end of the day, mobility is kind of just incorporated into your strength training.
Absolutely. And to separate that out so people can conceptualize it, it would often be like, okay, so you think of a bicep curl. Everyone thinks of bicep curl when they think of exercise. That's why you see all these pictures for fitness companies with like, oh, bicep curl. But like, if you think about that, that's not an end range drill necessarily. You could set it up to be. But if we incorporated joint level strengthening, we'd be actually taking the joint to an end range and then working there. Can you describe kind of what that would look like? You say, give an example of a joint and describe. It is strength still. I understand that. I want to give kind of a kind of peek through the looking glass for people here.
Well, we're going to unpack a few things, I guess, here with this stuff. So I guess like the question I have, especially when I start working with people, it gets into some philosophy shit. Because at the end of the day, what is strength training? What are we trying to do with strength training? So, I think when we typically talk about strength training, it's the pattern-based work with barbells, dumbbells. We're looking at pushing and pulling. We're looking at carries. We're looking at all that type of stuff. So I think when we start narrowing down strength training, it's more about effort and more about intent. And so essentially it's effort over a series of time. So we want high effort and we want short amount of time. That's essentially strength training. The nervous system doesn't register. I say this often because, again, a lot of the FRC guys do, and it makes a lot of sense to me, but the nervous system doesn't really register weight. So if I'm sitting there and I'm picking up heavy weight off the floor, it doesn't say my nervous system is picking up 135 pounds of weight off the floor in a deadlift pattern. It just knows effort, right? So in regards to the tissue will get will get stimulated, but at the end of the day, the nervous system registers effort. So that's all we're looking for, is just a good effort at certain ranges of motion where people lack. So again, if somebody has all the flexion in the world, then we might probably need to go after other deficiencies, maybe in the hip, maybe in other components of the shoulder, if you've done a pretty decent assessment on that. So at the end of the day, though, we want to put effort and drive neurological effort into tissue that really hasn't been driven into before, right? So the tissue that generally adapts quickest or tissue that really hasn't been trained before. And that's usually at end range for most people these days.
I'm pretty confident I have the answer to this question, but for people listening, how do you balance, like, you're a mobility wizard, obviously, but how do you balance people's mobility needs versus their desires for, like, aesthetics and strength and performance? Like, how do you actually find the balance between that?
Well, I was talking about this with another trainer, I think, the other day, but the assessment drives everything. So when you truly get a like an in-depth quality assessment on someone, you really get an idea of what their joints can do. So usually what I have a look at is if the joints function well, we can talk about doing a few more patterns and stuff like that, if that's what they want to do. If they don't have a functioning joint, let's say they don't have a hip that functions and rotates, then there really is no business loading that hip up if it's not functioning. They always say, again, in the FRC, is if you want to ensure an injury, you take a joint that doesn't function, you load it up and do repetitions. And I don't want to knock the CrossFit box gyms, but CrossFit.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, I do.
That was a heavy pause.
I just get no. At the end of the day, it's trying to understand what your joints are capable of doing and what they can't do. Working within the available range that you have, and then improving capacity on the ones that you don't.
So Calgary Movement Studio, FRC, is there protocols or, like, ranges? Like, not everybody needs insane amounts of external rotation or internal rotation. So how do you dictate what people's joints actually need? What's good, what's bad?
Absolutely, that's a good question, because I think that's the big answer for a lot of people. It's like, how much do I need? Right? What do I need and how much do I need? And a lot of it just depends on your everyday life. Like, what do you do? So that's generally essentially what you need. So obviously, if you're an athlete, you probably want to have all the available range that those joints require, give or take 10, 15 degrees. If you're general population, like, do we really need a direct overhead position?
Nope.
Right? Do we need 35, 40 degrees of hip internal rotation if you don't squat past 90 degrees and just sit up and off the chair? I think at the end of the day, you need a functioning joint, but depending on how much range of motion you need, it's just dependent on how much and what you do on a given day.
Well, I think that's a really good kind of kicking off point for the conversation of, like, why are we trying to fit a square peg into a round hole? And why would we take somebody who's 58 years old and be like, you know what, you've got to do handstands. You must. Like, the prioritization of what they need is something that I find miscarried in a lot of scenarios. It's like, well, I need overhead press because I want to work the shoulders. It's like, dude, you have so many options to work those shoulders that don't involve overhead pressing, and nor is that super valuable for you anyways. So it really opens up this concept of, well, what are we training for? Like, most people over, like, you've got a kid now, you know that now it's more about training for life now, which is interesting. But can you speak a little bit towards what kin stretch classes would do for people, why it would fit into their routine?
I was just going to say, we only have 2 mics, so, I'm sorry to interrupt. What you're saying too, I always say it's task completion versus task quality. Some people, CrossFit classes, are just about getting the task done regardless of the quality of said task. But
well,
yeah,
I think that's an interesting point as well. I think that's just how the human neurological system works, right? It's just it just sees a task and then it achieves the task with whatever capacity of joints it has.
Regardless if it's destroying itself in the process.
Your nervous system doesn't really know what's right or wrong. It just knows task completion, right? It's just like, here's the task, pick it up with whatever joints that I have. Those capacities of those joints will dictate what that movement looks like. And you'll see that often in the gym. Somebody that you can see just looks like a crappy squat. And odds are they got crappy capacity of hips, knees, ankles, back, whatever else is involved, right? So that's an interesting point. So yeah, All right, let's unpack this. So what we're looking at here is kin stretch. What I say, this can be essentially just movement practice. What I said the other day, and I think a few guys from the FRC say often, is that it is the best GPP. I don't know about the best. I'm a little biased on that one, but it's a very good GPP, which is general physical preparedness. So in a gym like this, in Evolve, where people have their goals that maybe aren't mobility based. Their goals are more task-based, weight completion, whatever it is. This can be a really good GPP for them. So just making sure that there's general movement practice, joint training, stuff that they don't generally get to in their everyday training. But at the end of the day, this can be somebody's full-on training as well. So, smaller classes can be tailored a little bit more towards individuals, whereas, bigger classes are going to be a little bit more general. But, at the end of the day, I think everybody just needs to move a little bit more, a little bit better, and a little bit more at the joint level with more intent. Geez, did I just say a whole pile of words there? Yeah. I don't know.
And you said yourself, though, like, have you heard of the terminology called grease the groove? You heard that?
Yeah, man.
That's what I was going to say. Say his name?
Pavel Satsulin.
So grease the groove was something that I implemented into my own training. It was essentially like you're doing stuff more regularly throughout the day at like say 60% capacity. So you're not pushing to high effort or failure or anything like that or technical breakdown at all. So for me, like developing my handstands, I'll just jump on the wall for a 10-second handstand anytime and just try to find a little bit of balance, say 20 times throughout the day, like twice every hour kind of deal like that. So you can treat your mobility practice as such as well. Is what you said, like you do for yourself to a degree?
Absolutely. We can treat there. This is the interesting conversation when we start talking about training. Is like, why do we have exercise in the first place? Like, who invented exercise and why do we have to do it? We invented exercise because we've all of a sudden found a society where we don't need to move as much. Now we're a big fat society that now has to invent something to keep moving.
Things got so safe all of a sudden.
Things got so safe. We had a bunch of calories. Now we need to invent something to keep our body moving. Where back in the day, we never really did that. So I'm talking about kind of hunter and gatherer days. There was no I have no proof of this, but again, I don't think a hunter gatherer would kind of wake up in the morning and say, it'd be a good thing to go for a run. I'm
going to burn some cows.
I'm going to do some zone 2 training right now. This is going to be good. So I don't think a lot of it was just tasks, right? It was just tasks, and then based on your joint capacity, you were achieving those tasks. So you had to go hunt, you foraged, you did whatever you do in a squat position. You pick something up. It'd be maybe a hinge movement, something like you'd be hitting hammer and stuff. So it's like all that stuff. I don't know if you guys seen that show Alone.
Yep.
Like when those guys come in and they go through a full day, they're working at a very low capacity for about 8 hours.
Trying to preserve calories.
Their whole day will consist of going to grab some water, forage for berries, and maybe go hunt, and make a fire, sleep. Like that's pretty much it.
So I think a takeaway that I just got from this a little bit, like a couple minutes before when you said that exercise is like a very rigid thing. People have this all or nothing mentality. Like, I only exercise when I hit the gym. I'll do my little cardio, warm up, lift weights, stretch, and then like I'm done for the day, versus making it just kind of part of your daily thing. Like when I talk about grease the groove, I was on vacation in Vancouver and we were waiting to get into a restaurant. Everybody just sitting there on their cell phones. I was outside doing like Cossack squats and side lunges, just trying to get, just like warm the hips up a little bit. Just
move more. We've gotten a habit of not moving at all, and now we've run into situations where we got 30-year-olds that got arthritis, bad backs, bad hips, bad shoulders, and we're like, well, what are you doing? And the answer is pretty much nothing. I'm doing nothing.
Well, even when the answer's something, in a lot of cases, it's going to be pathological, meaning they're doing that same thing so much that it's like, well, do you have options outside of that?
Well, see, this is the other thing. We start getting into more issues when we start thinking about having to jam-pack everything in an hour. Because now all of a sudden you're trying to get your cardio, your stretching, your strength work, your everything, and you're jam-packing in an hour after an 8-hour day of sitting. So it's like, what are we really trying to do? What are we really trying to train? What kind of changes are we trying to make in the body, and what are the actual goals, right? So, somebody's sitting there 8 hours a day. Do they really need to come in and max effort squat? I don't know. You tell me.
That's a rabbit hole we can get down in the future for sure. What people need at the end of the day as a trainer, I don't like to tell them what they need. Like I would like to say things like, you need a hip that can function. And I think that I'm fair to do that. But as far as where they want to go, sometimes the values that they have really don't fit what I would be like, you know what, that's a great idea. Sometimes it's like, well, I just want to be able to do handstand walks. And I'm like, but why? I don't get it. But it doesn't matter if I get it. What matters is that it's important to them. So I can train them for that and whatever. But I'm going to kind of veer this off because you got to get out of here soon. But I want to talk about the narrative that most people are involved in. So the reason that you got involved in Calgary Movement Studio, can you just share a brief thing? I got a question follow-up here, but why did you think that starting the Calgary Movement Studio was a good thing, and what are you trying to accomplish with that?
Well, I think in the grand scheme of things, I thought there was an opportunity within the building that we're in. I think there's some situations where we might not be as successful as maybe like a standalone brick and mortar store, that kind of deal. But I just feel like in a gym like this, where I feel like a lot of people need some help with joint training, whether they want to take it upon themselves or whether they want a little bit of help with that, I just feel like there's a little bit of an opportunity here. Got a chance to run some successful Kinstretch programs at Edgemont, and you got a chance to change a lot of people's lives. Like, that's one class that I thought made a huge impact on a lot of people's joint health and body control and just overall general health.
Yeah, when you use the system and you just follow it down the line, it's hysterical how many people you run into. They're like, well, the doctors told me this and the physio told me that. And when they start training their joint, they have a lot more options than they thought. And you can resolve a bunch of stuff that they had no hope for. Like one of my clients, Derek, he was pronounced permanently disabled by 2 physiatrists. And he has no lumbar pain anymore using this system. So I think that's really kind of where we overlap, is like, let's change lives, man. Let's show people there's a way out of it. And my follow-up question that I told you I have, the narrative that people run into. I have a big issue with this, so I'd like to talk about this for a second. Then tell me if I'm wrong here. I run into people all the time that come to me and say, well, my massage therapist said this, my physio said this, my doctor said this, and they come to you, A, confused, and B, feeling hopeless because they don't have really good answers, and they're trying, but they're getting no results. So there's some learned helplessness going on. And let's say they are getting some results. It's not necessarily resolved. So they come in feeling frustrated, overwhelmed, and often feeling like quitting. And the message that I'm trying to get across is, listen, I've seen this system work. If you take ownership for improving your skills as far as movement, you'd be surprised what you can do. And their diagnosis doesn't have almost anything to do with your prognosis, because they don't know that you're willing to train it and that you have this system at your disposal. Where do you land on that narrative? Have you experienced that same thing? And is that any part of why you're doing what you're doing with the Movement Studio now?
The narrative is interesting. We're in an industry that's not very regulated in terms of training. So we'll have so many levels of trainers. We can have somebody who's got 10 years experience, but maybe just one weekend course. We have somebody maybe who has 15 years experience with tons of courses under their belt, education. So there's lots of different levels of trainers. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just people have to start somewhere as a career. But I think the narrative that I see is that there's just not a lot of steps of trying to get better. Some people will just kind of land at a spot and kind of stay there. Just in regards to, I think, the personal training profession, but also we have these, we do have physio, chiro, massage, and then again, when people aren't speaking the same language, working with the same system, we can come across with 5 different answers from 5 different professionals. I used to run into an issue when I used to send people to a physio, chiro, when something was injured or wrong or whatever, I couldn't diagnose because I'm a trainer. They would come back with a diagnosis of tight hips, and I'm like, yeah, I told you that. I told you had tight hips. That's why I sent you there. So I started to take it upon myself to get a good referral system. And I think as soon as I got a good referral system, that narrative kind of changes a little bit. And then you're kind of inside of your own little bubble referral system, and you don't really need to venture outside of that too much. I do firmly believe that our healthcare system is failing us with this process because, when somebody gets injured, what's the process that you guys go through? Like, when you guys get injured, something happens, what do you do?
You just got injured.
You just got injured.
I'm injured twice. I got 2 ankle injuries. But I just deal with it myself, so.
Right? And I think that's probably what you'd find with most people, right? So, or you'd see them going to their doctor, general practitioner.
It depends on the severity of the injury, but I think most people generally, in my experience, if they get injured and it's serious enough that it's causing pain or there's excess swelling, they go to their doctor for something. If it's muscle related, I hate this. Oh, it's like muscle tissue related, and the doctor's like, oh yeah, my doctor's sending me for an x-ray. I'm like, for what? Like, why are we going for an x-ray for soft tissue damage? Like, what are we doing?
Why are we going to a general practitioner that doesn't work with soft tissue as a specialty?
The doctor just says, just rest it for 2 weeks. It's probably arthritis. Take a couple of days off.
Can you touch your toes? No, it's probably just old age.
It hurts when you touch your toes. Don't touch them.
So I guess the process that I've, kind of getting used to taking now is, I'll depending what happens, we'll go to my my physio chiro. I'm going to throw a little shameless plug to old Roger Menta. He's also works with the system, and again, he's one of those guys that probably is in Calgary second to none in terms of diagnosis.
So I'm going to pause there. I want you to continue that conversation, but Roger Menta is very good. Yep. Like, he's the guy that got me my diagnosis. So I'm struggling for years with the health system. And I run into Roger, and he does an assessment on me, and he's like, yo, dude, your movement is too good for this. Like, you need to see a neurologist right now. And I think it's something in the neighborhood of. I had my proper diagnosis after 6 years of searching, like 3 weeks from then. So, like, a good chiro, I have to shamelessly plug him because he actually had a big impact on my life doing that for me. But when you, like you were talking about earlier, doing a proper assessment, he wasn't just like, oh yeah, well, your hip, it's your hip. That's what everyone kept saying. I'm like, I can't really feel my foot and my leg doesn't work right. I can't go upstairs. And Roger was like, no, listen, I've assessed that and there is something neurologically wrong. So anyways, he's good. Continue to talk about your referral network.
Yeah. So again, that assessment comes, right? So if we're dealing with an injury, we need to know what we're dealing with, especially if I'm a trainer, if I'm going to be working with this, I want to know what I'm dealing with. If we're going to work with that, then we need to have a very specific diagnosis so we can give specific inputs to get that specific tissue back to where it needs to be. So for me, that again was a little bit of a game changer as well, because again, dealing with a lot of these injured people, now I got a referral guy that kind of comes in and says, do this, gives me some guidelines, makes me look super smart. I just do what he says, and then people get better. So at the end of the day, like, it just really is about finding a good assessment, a good starting point, whether that's with an injury, whether that's with training, whether that's with just anything, right? So
I think the hardest part of that, though, is finding said good practitioner,
Yep.
whether it's PT, chiro, physio. And I think even myself, I get exhausted. I had a motorcycle injury 12 years ago, and after, like, you search through 3 chiros, you're like, they're all just quacks. Like, this isn't going anywhere. So you just stop searching. Yep. And then I just gave up on things like my low back injury until Curtis was like, you had a low back injury? I had a low back injury. Let me help you. And I was like, you're not going to fix this, man.
Things you can do.
And then all of a sudden, it's fixed.
Yeah.
He said that to my face, too.
I don't think so, man. His stupid face. That one right there. So should we wrap this bad boy up?
So right before we clear this sucker up, we've talked a lot about functional range systems. Calgary Movement Studio, obviously what we're trying to do is change people's lives. How do we do that? We're taking them through kin stretch courses, and we're trying to show them this is how you can take ownership over your joint health and your tissues. One of the biggest things that we want to accomplish with that studio is giving people the option and to engage in a system that actually follows a set process where we can actually accomplish something. And your concept of the referral network, I think the biggest thing with the referral network is that they can speak the same language, so we can all, all the horses pull in the same direction, everything gets easier, right? Yeah. So I think we fall in a very similar mind frame, which is why we're doing this thing together. But do you have anything else that you wanna say as far as closing up the conversation on strength training and joint training and kind of where people need to get to?
Not much, I don't think. I guess if you feel like you've never done joint training, get in there and do joint training. If you feel like you've done nothing but repetitions on biceps, leg curls.
Don't look at me when you say biceps like that.
Well, I don't have big arms, so I'm just looking at the guys who have big arms. So
right.
If you feel like that's all you've been doing and you're getting joint pain, getting that, there's systems in place to help you out. So do some joint training. Try out some of this kin stretch. Try out some of this Calgary Movement Studio. And
So the Movement Studio is located at Evolve Strength, Royal Oak in the northwest section of Calgary. You boys are the handsome owners, and I will link your Instagrams in the description of said podcast. Yeah.
guys, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it here. Great podcast.
Well, thanks for coming out. I really appreciate it, especially like the first 2 minutes. If you didn't watch the YouTube on the first 2 minutes, zone in. Bryan mean-mugged the camera. He was like, yeah, you're going to see some nice eye contact
Pretty,
there.
pretty awkward. But
Thanks for coming out, man. Appreciate it.
Ayo.
Thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate your support.
If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you would subscribe, follow, and throw us a like on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts.